As we look at today's text, I want you to go to Matthew chapter 9 and verses 9 through 13. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at his tax collector's booth. "Follow me and be my disciple," Jesus said to him. So Matthew got up and followed him. Later, Matthew invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests, along with many tax collectors and other, note this, disreputable sinners. But when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with such scum?" When Jesus heard this, he said, "Healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do." Then he added, "Now go and learn the meaning of this scripture. I want you to show mercy, not offer sacrifices. For I've come to call not those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners." Amen. Isn't that a powerful reading of scripture? I want to talk to you about the grace to make tough decisions. You may be seated, and you might have all kind of imagination about what that would mean. Now, I want to tell you what that tough decision is that I want you to think about. I want you to think about the tough decision of reaching out to people who are needy. Tough decision of reaching out to someone who's not like you, doesn't smell like you, doesn't look like you, doesn't behave like you, that you might not even like. There are a few people who are here this morning who will remember 1981 when I first came here as a pastor, and one Sunday, or more than one Sunday, I said something like this. I said, I want you to imagine before you give your missions offering today, that God is going to take your mission offering and he's going to sovereignly, by his divine hand, pick it up from right where you are, and in a moment he's going to transfer it to some dark place on the continent, into the middle of a jungle, to someone who doesn't dress with all the clothes you dress with, who doesn't look like you, who doesn't smell like you, and who's wearing strange things. And God's going to take your missions gift over right now and touch them, and then he's going to pick them up just like they are in their native situation. And in a moment, next 5 seconds, God's going to sit them down right beside you. And you're going to go, "What on earth? Can somebody do something to refresh the air?" You know, there are places in the world people don't take baths. Did you know that? Water has to be carried for miles. Do you know that we have had people come to Charlottesville that their body odor was so strong that you could smell them 5 to 10 feet away in stores? And did you know that to them it's pleasant and it's even romantic? You didn't know that, did you? Yes, it's true. So here's the conclusion of what I said back some 33 years ago. If you would be offended and get up and run out of church if that person were to be set right beside you, if you would say, "I will never go back there," then you should probably put your missions offering back in your pocket, because you won't be blessed for giving it. How many of you remember me saying something like that? There's got to be some of you. Raise your hand just so somebody says, "Yes, Pastor Barry, I remember that." Now, you see, the truth of the matter is the tough decisions that we have to make in grace, the grace that God would work in and through us, must be to reach the people who are needy. I look over and Rahel and Simon, I want y'all to stand up just so people know who you are. Rahel and Simon. Yeah, okay. Here's a new couple to our church. Look over. They're Bangladesh. She is a missionary leader's daughter. In fact, you just helped to send $1,000 for her dad to buy Bibles for pastors in Bangladesh. Her husband, yeah, go ahead. Her husband is Simon, and he has a MBA. They're new to America. I'm just going to do a little commercial here. They're working for very low wages because they're new here, bright, talented, and well-educated. You need to pray. One of the things on my target list as a pastor is to get these two people promoted and get them up into a salary range where they can be more accommodating and more involved in ministry. Now, her dad works with people in remote areas of Bangladesh that are not like him, that are Muslim, that will kill you in some cases. And that's what her dad does. He goes to find people who are not like him. Thank you, and you may be seated. And all over the world, that's what's happening. My sister lives in Colombia, and her husband. And there in Colombia, South America, they work with all kinds of people. It's not their native culture. My sister's North Carolinian. My brother-in-law's from Chicago. And they've been there now 8 or 9 years ministering. My brother-in-law goes up and down and has gone up and down the Amazon River into remote areas. He's gone over to people in the jungle that basically wore little or no clothes, won the sheep to the Lord, taught them some things about Christ to where they began to look and act like Christians. I'm talking to you about grace to see needy people. Now, I want you to hear this. This is a very important message for you. Predicate just a little more. In America, we take people who are really needy out of circulation. It's rare for us to see people out who are paraplegic. Is that paraplegic? What is it? What's the word? All right. When's the last time you saw a person that had no arms and no legs? We used to have a man who attended church here, and he had no arms. They'd been jerked off in a machine. He drove a car and all, but he had no arms, period. But when's the last time you actually saw a person that had no arms, no legs? When's the last time you saw a person with leprosy? Do you know we have lepers in America? Do you know we have a place to send lepers? Oh, you thought it was all gone? No, not true. People in America get leprosy. We have places to keep the mentally ill. We have places that we put criminals. We have places that we put people and ways to treat them if they're like missing an eye or if they're deformed. We rebuild their faces. Dr. Connor, who's one of our parishioners here, he's literally rebuilt people's whole face. That's his specialty as a surgeon and a dentist. I mean, some of the pictures he showed in the classroom almost made some people sick, I think, when they saw the kind of work that he had done to restoration. But in many countries of the world, there are no such doctors as Dr. Connor. Now, I want you to understand that. First of all, in our culture, we're kind of aesthetic, and we hide people away, and we cover them up, and we secure them, so we don't see a lot of strange things. But there are nevertheless things that are out there. Now, keep that in mind as we work through the sermon next few minutes. What you have here is Jesus is now walking along, and he sees a man sitting at a tax collector's booth. Now, keep in mind that what you're reading in Matthew was written by the man who was the tax collector. He's the one who wrote the story. So he could have written it. One day Jesus passed by and I was sitting at a tax collector's booth. but he hides it away subtly. All the Gospels tell us, all the evangelists that write different books tell the same story, different versions. For example, Matthew does not say that he left all when Jesus came by. Luke tells that. So Matthew doesn't applaud himself in the book of Matthew. But he says, Jesus passed by and he said, follow me and be my disciple. And Jesus said to him, so Matthew got up and followed him. Later, Matthew invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests. Now, again, Matthew does not say that a banquet was prepared. Luke tells that because that would have made it look like, hey, guess what? I left everything and I followed Jesus, and then I invited Jesus down to my house for steak. So Matthew doesn't tell that. Matthew just says that there was a man who was a tax collector. Jesus passed by. Jesus saw him. Jesus said, follow me. And that man, whoever that man was, like Matthew doesn't know, says, come to my house and there's going to be dinner. Now, this is remarkable because what I want you to see is that Jesus saw someone who was needy. Jesus looked down at a tax collector and saw someone that was not well liked, that people hated, that people would actually take detours. And let me help you understand a little bit about tax collectors in Jesus' day. What you had to do is you had to have enough money to buy the right to be a tax collector. That's right. You bought the right to be a tax collector. So you had to have money. And you would go and negotiate with Rome. So Rome would simply tell the Jewish kingdom, you have to turn in this much money to Caesar. They just set the amount. How the Jews worked that out, Rome didn't care. So then Jewish people would pay to be the tax collectors. I will bring in this much money. Let's just say 1,000 shekels every month I will bring to Rome. Okay? Now here's the strange thing. There were no laws for this. There were no rules. You got that? I am going to bring in 1,000 shekels, and I am authorized and deputized by Rome to get it out of you. Any way I can get it out of you, it's legal. So what I can do is I get up this morning and I say, yep, there's going to be pilgrims going down this way today. So I go over here and I set me up a booth. And it's the way that people are moving today. I'm trying to always figure where are the people coming. Now, this is curious. I want you to get the picture. Because when you come, I look at you and I can be totally judgmental. It's all up to me. Nobody can call my hand. I can't be arrested. And you say, I say, well, where are you headed? You say, well, you're going to have to, I need some tax money. And I'd say, well, why? I've just paid over there. He said, yeah, okay. And so I looked and I said, well, you've got 3 sheep with you. So I charge you a half of a shekel for each sheep, let's say. And you don't have any sheep. You got a donkey. I'm going to charge you a shekel for your donkey. I'm going to charge you a shekel for your donkey, and then you've got chickens. Okay, I charge you, a farthing or like a penny for each chicken you have. You don't have that, so you're pulling the cart, and it's got 4 wheels, and so I charge you for 4 wheels. I charge you for each wheel. I get to make it up. The rules are all in the tax collector's hand. Can you see why they were so despised? Why they were so hated? And Jesus passes by a Jew who had been taxed, probably many times, and sees Matthew sitting there, and something about him attracted Jesus' attention. And Jesus says to him, look, I see emptiness in you, and I think you're not happy with your job. And Jesus, in a sense, leans over to care and to respect and to pay attention to this person, to actually address him and look at him and say, would you like to follow me? Would you like to do this? Now, it takes a lot of grace to do that. And so what I want you to do is transport that in your life. I want you to understand that this private world we live in America is contrary to the gospel. It's contrary to the gospel. This notion that nobody, I get to live my life privately and I shouldn't interfere with other people's life. This tolerance to just kind of draw a line and not see people except as functionaries in your life. You know, the waitress is the waitress. You know, that's it, that's all. No, the waitress is a person. The person in the convenience store is a person. To speak to them, to address them, to go out of your way. Do you know, have you ever just slowed down, looked at the people who get trash out of the streets and said, thank you for what you're doing? Have you ever thought about if trash men went on strike for a month, what our city would be like? Have you ever thought about how the rat population would increase and disease? Have you thought about that? How cockroaches would multiply by the millions in 1 month if people didn't pick up trash? See, there are no little people that are too little to be appreciated. So when we leave church today and we go out and we start thinking about little people, we think about people that we don't even like, people who do things that are not like we do them. They don't look like us. You know, I confess to you, I struggle when I meet Muslims. It's honest with me. I'm being honest with you to tell you, because I'm first, I don't know who to trust. 2, I so disrespect the religion that I shake my head and I say, how can they do this? How can they follow something like Islam? So I have to force myself to say, hi, good morning, how are you? Now, just tell me you're different. I mean, if I walked into the bank tomorrow and there were a Muslim behind the counter with the garb on, or a Muslim woman, and I've had this happen, I have to force myself to be nice because I immediately start having negative thoughts. So just judge me. That's okay. Pray for me. But I'm telling you, there are those in my life I have to get a hold of myself and say, hey, wait a minute, now hold on, they're a person. It takes compassion to look beyond and to see the pain of the other person and their need. But then it takes grace in us for needy people to change. Imagine Jesus thinking that he could take somebody who's probably done many injustices and have them follow him. Now remember, this is so important. You live in America where the law says every child goes to school. Do you know that we have vehicles that run back roads and all over the county, and some of our people actually have driven those vehicles. Some of my friends drive them, and they'll drive 30, 40 miles one way to pick up one student that's perhaps crippled or mentally retarded or whatever else, and to take them to school one way. And we pay for the car, we pay for the driver, because the law says that every child in America has a right to go to school till age 16 free. So we spend enormous money, but you've got to go over to the time of Jesus and understand that in the time of Jesus, you didn't even go to school if you couldn't afford it. You had to pay. But if by the age of 8 you had not memorized like the book of Genesis and the book of Deuteronomy, you didn't go to school anymore. If you couldn't quote the book of like Genesis and Deuteronomy. By the age of 12, if you could not quote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy verbatim without flaw, skipping no prepositions, no verbs, no adverbs, you did not go to school anymore, and you were sentenced to follow the trade of your father. Further, you did not choose your teacher even at age 12. Rabbis have to choose their own students. So therefore, it was huge for Jesus to look over at Matthew, who can read, who can write, who does understand money, and to say to him, would you like to go to school with me? I am willing to be your rabbi. I want you to get that picture. This is radical. This is huge, that he would choose a grown man who is a business person, a despicable business person, and say, would you like to go to school with me? Jesus saw him. Jesus cared enough for grace to be poured out and to say, I can see a different future for Matthew. Jesus saw his possibilities and offered him an open door. Jesus opened his heart for Matthew to step into a new future. I taught 8th grade just after we were married. And I had an 8th grade African-American girl named Bessie, who lived in a Jim Walters home that was probably not much more than 25 feet square, with 2 bedrooms, with 12 children, and a mom and a dad. 14 people lived in that little house that was probably not more than 700 square feet. Bessie was the sweetest person, but her life was so hard. But she was a good student. And I would drive 1,000 miles today to see Bessie. I would pay in a heartbeat for her to have an airline ticket if I knew where Bessie is, to fly here. I would love to see Bessie because I poured all that I could as a teacher into Bessie to tell her, you're capable, you're smart, you're a writer, you can do this. And she excelled in that 1 year of the 8th grade. But I know no more about Bessie. Who's the Bessie in your life? Who have you poured into? What grace have you poured out into somebody's life? I'm asking you that this morning. I'm wanting you to see the great value that was placed. I want you to see Jonathan in the Old Testament, who was the king's son. And he saw David, who was a shepherd boy. And Jonathan said to him, I can see that God's favor is with you. And Jonathan takes off his cloak, the prince's cloak, and gives it to him, and gives him his military armor, gives it to David. And he says, promise me one day when you are king that you will favor my family. Do you see the grace poured out? Jonathan is such a magnificent story of grace. Seeing somebody in need. I want you to also see that in the New Testament, there's a story of Paul and Barnabas and John Mark. And Paul does not like John Mark. We don't know all the reasons for that. Some scholars surmise that it is John Mark, who was part Roman and part Jew, who threw off his cloak and ran in the night in the Garden of Gethsemane. And that night of the Garden of Gethsemane, somewhere something about John Mark rattled Paul the apostle. I mean, Paul's the consummate scholar. He studied under the world famous Gamaliel. He studied under one of the greatest scholars of his day. Paul's got it all down in the head. He speaks probably multiple languages. He's just a genius of sorts. And something about John Mark rattled Paul. But you know what? Paul wouldn't even let him go on a missionary trip with him. It finally divided Paul and John and Barnabas until they took two separate trips. And John Mark went with Barnabas. Read on in the story, though. Read when Paul's in prison. What does he say? Bring Mark. He's sure been a blessing to me. He's been a blessing. I want you to see this morning that there is the grace to see people who are needy, the grace to believe that they can change, and then there's the grace to allow them to become beautiful, the grace to give them wings to fly, the grace to release them and to bless them. Matthew became a disciple. You know what? He was not one of the three, Peter, James, and John. He was not in that inner circle, but he was one of the disciples. I got to imagining that one day as one of the disciples that Matthew was with them, and they're saying, you know what? You know, we're kind of getting into ministry now, and we need to think about a treasurer and who's going to handle the money. And somebody says, well, you know, Matthew used to be a tax collector, and he certainly understands money and accounting. He's pretty skilled. He's like a CPA in accounting, and he understands all this. And I can just imagine Matthew just lifting his hand and saying, it's too close to money, not me. I'm afraid of the temptation. I wonder, does it resonate with you in your life that you must always run away from that which you were when you were a sinner? Do you understand that? Do you understand that if as a sinner you love things as a Christian, that's always a half inch away? Do you understand that? Do you understand that whatever took you down into sin is always lurking right outside the door? It's just right there. Was it lust of the flesh? Were you a carnal person who loved parties on a Saturday night? Was it things? Was it money? Were you full of pride? As a sinner, did you always love to talk about what you had and why you thought you were better than other people? It's always just outside the door of those of us who are children of God. It's just outside the door. And we must always be willing to look boldly at those things that would tempt us and take us back and say, I'm not going back. I'm not going back. I don't want to get close to that. I'm afraid if I were to get close to that, it would drag me in. I'm smart enough to know how much I used to like to do that, and I'm not willing to get close to that again. I'm not hearing many amens this morning, but sometimes I just know that what I'm preaching is sound doctrine, and it's just the truth of life. That's why the Bible said you need to flee, run away from, push away from you, turn your back and run. Run away from those temptations or those things that would pull you back to who you were before you met Christ. Don't get close. Run as hard as you can. So my question is this morning, how is grace going to work in your life? That's the question. Because the way that grace works in your life is the testimony you have of Jesus. It's the grace that you manifest that others see in you. That's what draws people to you. That's what attracts other people to you. It's the grace that you bestow. Now, there's nobody escapes. Some sermons I could preach about some esoteric titles perhaps, and there'd be some of you here that say, that doesn't pertain to me. I can listen and it's truth, but it doesn't pertain. But this is the kind of sermon no one escapes. You have to think about, how is grace being poured out in your life? How are others seeing you? How do your coworkers see you? How do those who are in your family see you? How do your neighbors see you? Do they see you as someone who's approachable? Do they see you as someone that they can come to and that you'll be kind to them? That's the struggle. That's where your grace has to reach across. That's where you have to do your toughest praying. You know, one of our neighbors has cattle, and his cattle often in our yard. I mean, they've messed up our yard more ways than I will describe from the pulpit, including their feet in the wet soil at times and having to correct it. And I put up with it for 4 or 5 years. One day, I asked him to simply crank a machine and push some snow off. And he looked at me and said, let's have an understanding. The best way to get along with neighbors is have nothing to do with them. Do you understand? And he turned around and walked off. Never cranked his machine, left me to shovel the snow. He also traveled down the same road, and he had the equipment to move it. Now, I want to tell you, that didn't sit well with me. Can I be honest with you? It took me a little while. Layla had to talk to me. Jesus had to talk to me. The Holy Spirit had to deal with me. And I kept chasing cows out of the yard, even until now. Sometimes I'm dressed up like this coming out the door, and they're cows. And I'm a country boy. And I'm frightened because if one of his cows should get in the road and somebody'd hit it and be killed, he could be sued and lose everything he has. And I care about that. And I just want you to understand. I want you to take it home with you today. I guarantee you that if I were to sit with you 30 minutes, I could find a place in your life that you struggle with grace. Do you believe that? I believe there's a place in your life that you have a hard time seeing needy people, those who are not like you. And this sermon's about that this morning. This sermon is about you seeing needy people like Matthew and saying, there's a chance for you. There's a window for you. Could I put some wind in your sails? Could I be a blessing to you? Could I serve you? Could I help you? I'm willing to do my part. So how's grace going to work in us this week? I wonder as we leave today, will we start thinking about who are the little people? Who are the needy people in our lives? May it be so. Maybe it's here that we start. I'm the most needy. I need my heart corrected. I need my eyes open so that I see other people and so that I don't measure them by the things they have. So that I don't assume that someone who's driving a nice car, living in a big house, has it all together. So that I don't assume that the wealthy tax collector has no need of the simple truth of the gospel. Help me, Lord Jesus, to see that there are needy people. I was perhaps 13 years of age. I was a newspaper boy in North Wilkesboro, North Carolina. One of my customers was very, very wealthy, and he was very arrogant. Even if people from my dad's congregation went to him for dental work, and if they tried to talk to him, he would say things like, I don't need God. I'm rich enough. When I get to hell, I will air condition it. I've got enough money to cool hell down when I get there. And as a 13-year-old boy, that kind of story and putting the newspaper on his porch every day I didn't want to even talk to him. I didn't want to even see him. I just wanted him to leave my money in an envelope and me be gone. I didn't want to be around somebody who was so arrogant and high and lifted up. But one morning, I threw the paper on his porch, and it was like any other morning, except that last night he laid in a bathtub and took a pistol and ended his life. And I suddenly realized how needy he had been, how desperately needy that rich man was. Don't you assume that anyone you meet who does not know Jesus is not needy. Do not assume that any person you meet that has been following Jesus for 50 years and you call them a saint. Count on it. Bank on it. Assume it. They are needy, and they need you to bestow grace in their life. They need you to humble yourself and serve.
To find out more about us, visit us on the web at covenantchurch.net. Thank you for joining us today.